Good afternoon and welcome to EKU Then and Now. I'm your host, Paul Blanchard, and I've been a faculty member and administrator at Eastern for more than 35 years. This new monthly series will focus on prominent and distinguished EKU faculty, staff, and alumni who've had a meaningful involvement at Eastern during its history of more than 100 years. They will comment on what EKU has been like during its storied past, how it's changed, and what we might expect its future to hold. Our first guest in this new series is Dr. Bill Ellis, who is a longtime foundation professor at EKU and who's the author of A History of Eastern Kentucky University, The School of Opportunity, which was published as EKU celebrated its centennial in 2006. I'll ask Dr. Ellis some questions about his own long history at Eastern and then talk some about what he has learned from writing this much acclaimed book about EKU. Bill, thanks for joining us on EKU Then and Now. We're going to talk about things that you and I love to talk about anyway. But first, tell us a little bit about why and when you came to EKU the first time.
I came to Eastern as a student in the fall of 1966. Actually, I'd been here in the summer of 1965 to a high school history teachers conference for 8 weeks. I'd never been to Eastern. I was a graduate of Georgetown, but I knew quite a few people who had gone to Eastern, including some of my relatives, and became introduced to the school. And in '66, Eastern, becoming a university, could offer courses, master's degrees in history and English for the first time.
Were you aware of a president named Dr. Robert R. Martin back then?
I had heard of Dr. Martin. Like I said, I had a couple of relatives who had come to Eastern during that time and knew about Bob Martin. And of course, I'd been although I'd never been to any Eastern basketball or football games, back in the 50s, probably more so than even now, people followed what was going on in sports and what was going on in education generally by reading the newspaper. We read the Courier-Journal back in those days, almost religiously in Shelbyville. So I knew a lot about Eastern, and I knew about Bob Martin. Of course, I don't think I ever met him except at my graduation in 1967, but I certainly met him when I came to school. I came here to teach in 1970.
Well, let's talk about those days in the 70s. You and I came here about the same time. I came in 1972 and 70 as well, and of course, that was the end of what Bob Martin called a decade of greatness, as I recall, and all kinds of things being built. What are your memories of Bob Martin as a new faculty member in the social science department?
Bob Martin was a politician, had always been a politician, and as I started working on the history of Eastern, I became even more aware of how adept a politician he was and had been throughout his time as president of Eastern. But coming up through the ranks in politics and through the ranks in education, Martin learned a lot about how things worked in not only Frankfort but also in Washington. And he was very good at pulling the right strings and finding the right people to talk to. He's not totally exceptional. There were a lot of people in Kentucky, including Adrian Doran at Moorhead, and presidents at Western and Murray and other schools who were also had pretty much come up the same way as Martin. And they knew the political realities of the time. And they were able to work not always together, but at least in concert in trying to further education in Kentucky. Their big adversary was always the University of Kentucky. And it was always rather humorous that Martin would always come up with ways of describing the University of Kentucky as UK became known as the flagship university of the state. He would often make references as if he was forgetting it was called flagship, and he would call it the battleship or something else, just to insert a little humor. But he was.
But let me interrupt.
Yeah,
and at that time, you had an academic at UK, a historian, Otis Singletary.
Right.
And I expect that guys like Bob Martin often got the better of him because of their political skill. Is that your memory?
He was more adept at getting the better of someone like President Oswald, who came before Singletary. Singletary told the story that the first Council on Higher Education meeting that he came to the meeting, and he was met by Bob Martin and Adrian Dorn, and they were just so effusive. They were so glad to meet him and so glad that he had come to the University of Kentucky. And Singletary felt like he was just so warmly welcomed. And then the meeting started, and the first thing that happened was that Adrian Dorn introduced a resolution to remove the community colleges from the University of Kentucky. So Singletary said he knew he was in for a fight.
From the time Bob Martin was president in 1960 to the time he left in '76, I think that the campus was really transformed. And, you know, dealing now maybe with your memories as well as your research in the book, you know, what's the consensus about Bob Martin's role and contribution during his presidency? Martin was
interested in building, and he caught on to a trend not just in Kentucky but in the nation, that in the 60s, really beginning in the 50s, with particularly with the GI Bill of Rights, that colleges and universities just grew exponentially. They couldn't build enough buildings fast enough. Mm-hmm. The economy was growing. Educational opportunities were opening up for people that had never been to college or to a university before. The programs of particularly the Johnson administration gave more money for education, particularly to give people that couldn't afford a college education grants and loans to go to college.
And of course, Lyndon Johnson actually came to our campus during that time.
Lyndon Johnson received the first honorary degree from Eastern. So Martin was able to catch on to that and to have foresight to do things that some people, even though they were also involved in changing really the whole nature of American higher education, he saw things that other people sometimes missed out on. For example, he saw the opportunity to build a school of law enforcement, which the University of Kentucky had that opportunity, and they sort of bypassed it. Well, he just jumped right in and got it done, as well as also a new nursing program. And he and John Rowlett were able to implement these programs and get legislative support where other people might have just overlooked them and said, we don't need to be doing something like this. Universities like Eastern, being regional and multi-purpose all over the country, have to look for a niche. Mm-hmm. And Eastern found its niche in funding and finding programs like this. It doesn't mean that they did away with like the college education. Eastern still trains maybe more teachers than any other school in the state. And you have people that are taking history degrees like I did, but the focus has to be on the students, the number of students that you can get into these larger programs. And that's always been true.
Now in these two programs you mentioned, for which Eastern is really known, it's the law enforcement and nursing. What do you think John Rowlett's role, how critical a role did he play in getting those programs going?
John's role was very crucial. Martin more or less gave John the head to get into something like this, and John did a lot of research. Some people found Rowlett sometimes to be indecisive, and I think, like all people, personalities played a role in that. But John was very adept at working the system, and he was very good at working, for example, Congressman Perkins, who was a great friend of Eastern as well as the whole state of Kentucky. And Congressman Perkins was able to open doors for Rowlett and for Martin to get a lot of federal money to come to Eastern to help get these programs started and to keep them running. Rowlett was extremely important, and I don't think his role can be minimized when you look at the beginning of these programs.